Hello, I want to talk to you a little bit about life in British North America and a little bit about life in Spanish North America. Since about a third of our country used to be under the control of Spain, I think it's worth noting kind of, and maybe drawing a little bit of comparing and contrasting here. By 1700, the British control big chunks of North America in the east, and Mexico and what's now the southwestern part of the United States, including California and Texas, were controlled by Spain. And the Russians had a little bit of a tail up there off of Alaska, had some claims down as far as Oregon. The French had a little bit of territory in what's now Canada, plus some trade networks all over the place, but they didn't really own a lot of trade. The Dutch and the Portuguese, as far as North America is concerned, they'd been completely pushed out. So, but the two dominant forces are definitely Spain and England. All right, so life in the Spanish colonies. It was all about land. Okay, the Spanish believed very strongly in something called latifundia. Latifundia is a Latin word. It doesn't translate well into English. Basically, what latifundia means is that the only wealth that is really considered real wealth must have ties to the land. In other words, in order for a person to have honest wealth as opposed to kind of dirty money, that money has to come from either farming or from mining. And anything else is just kind of suspicious. So merchants are going to be viewed with a little bit of suspicion, whereas farmers and people who own mines, things like this, they're going to be looked at favorably. All right. And well, both of those are very labor intensive properties. And so you had to have a lot of workers. You had to have a huge number of laborers. And in order to do that, you're going to encourage a couple things. Number one, you're going to encourage slavery. And slavery was definitely a thing in Mexico all the way down, although it was not as big as some places. Adjust this just a sec here. Okay. And, but especially the Spanish Caribbean and in Spanish South America, slavery is really larger. And in fact, in some ways, especially the Caribbean, is considerably larger than the United States. Only about 3% of slaves actually end up in what's now the United States. The other 97% either end up in the Caribbean working on sugar plantations or tobacco plantations, or they're going to end up in places like Brazil, where they're working in fazendu, and the word we get factory from, where again they're working with agricultural products. And it was very back-breaking labor. And so they used a lot of the slaves for that. They also used a lot of slaves in the mining industry. You went in there and you have the hole in the ground, and the big export is actually silver. It's not gold in Mexico. It's silver, which is much more important because there's a lot more of it. Another thing that was important to export in Spanish America was red dye. It comes from dead caterpillars. It's actually caterpillar blood. It's cochina, I think is what it's called. And it was a big one. Some years it was even pretty close to the exports in Spanish silver. And that Spanish silver is going to be really important. It's going to become almost a global currency, the Mexican peso, which is actually the Spanish real, or the pieces of 8. And they would get that name because it would be 30 grains, and they would cut it into 8 pieces, and hence the term pieces of 8. And if you've ever been a cheerleader or gone to a pep rally, you may have done the 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits, $1. All for Howard College, stand up and holler. Well, okay, that comes from that, where they would cut the coins into 8 pieces, and they would call them a bit, or a piece of 8. And the American dollar would later be modeled after that Spanish real, that Mexican peso, in terms of what size and purity of silver it is. All right, so but that latifundia. Another way that they got laborers was something called the encomienda, another Spanish Latin word that doesn't translate well. Encomienda is a debt for taxes and services kind of thing. If you were a landowner, one of the things you could do is you could purchase an encomienda from the government. See, the government, the local Indians did not have a lot of money, and yet they were, and sometimes the poor Spaniards did not have a lot of money. And so they would be taxed, but instead of paying their taxes in silver or in something that was spendable, they would pay their tax in hours of labor. All right, so if you were a wealthy enough landowner in Spain, in Spanish America, you could purchase that encomienda, and basically you're giving cash to the government, and in exchange, these people who are paying their taxes in hours of labor will now work for you. Um, Whether it's fair or not is kind of inconsequential, but that provided a lot of the labor for the mining industry, especially, but also for improvements in the land. You know, if you're going to build a mine, you want to be able to get your product from the mine to the port, and so you would build your own road. Well, that was usually done with encomienda labor, and it wasn't a lifetime thing. It wasn't even a year-round thing. When you paid your taxes, maybe you paid your taxes, you owed the government 100 hours of labor. And so that might be 10 hours a week for 10 weeks, and then you're off the hook for another year. And so it became a way of providing labor in an area where labor is scarce, especially semi-skilled labor is scarce. And so that was another way that in the Spanish America that they provided that needed labor in order to get their crops and mining and everything like this done. Another thing that's going to happen during this time is there's going to be a real stratification in Spanish America in that you have, based on what they call cleanliness of blood, limpieza de sangre. And for those of you who speak Spanish, I apologize. My pronunciation is terrible, and I know it. Sorry. But anyway, so the limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood. And if you were a peninsulare, that is someone of pure European blood who was born on the Spanish peninsula, all right, then you were seen as higher in society. Any of the good jobs, they're going to go to you. All right, so the generals are going to be peninsulare, governors are peninsulare, the viceroy peninsulare, important guild masters, they're always going to be peninsulare. All right, because they're of pure European blood and they're born in Spain and probably educated in Spain as well, come over as adults. And so they're considered higher up in society than the Creole. A criollo in Spanish, a criollo is someone who is of pure European blood, but born in the New World. And somehow being born in the New World corrupts your blood in the eyes of the Spanish and the Portuguese, and to a lesser degree the French. The English had something completely different. And so they had this idea then. So imagine if, like in the military, your colonels and your generals are probably going to be peninsulare. The rest of your officers are going to be Creoles. If you've ever had Creole cooking, that comes from the French Creoles. These are people of pure European blood that were born in Louisiana, and so they have that term, but it's not quite like the hierarchy that the Spanish had. And part of this is because of a trust issue. The Spanish didn't really trust people who were not born in Spain. And so Creoles were high up because they had that pure blood. And you could, trust me, you could purchase a certificate to prove you had pure blood. It wasn't quite as good as Ancestry DNA, I'm sure. It was basically your word for it. But you could show that slide. Hey, look, I am a limpieza de sangre. And so you could get that and be declared a Creole. Some of your less important alcaldes and city council, these were oftentimes Creoles, and many of your wealthier Creoles, they sent their children back to Spain to be educated so that they can have that Spanish experience. Although it is worth noting that the oldest university in the Western Hemisphere is in Mexico City. It was founded by the Spanish in the 1540s. And so they did believe in education here too. It's just the wealthier ones tended, kind of like sending people to private school or something like this. I got to go to Harvard so I can have a funny accent. And that's what they did there. All right, below that you had your mestizos. Your mestizo was a person of European and Indian blood. And once you're a mestizo, man, if your great-great-great-grandfather was a mestizo, all of his descendants are mestizos. You never get that purity of blood back. And they would be, well, the reality is after a while, they were the majority of Mexico. So much so that later a Mexican politician would actually say that the Mexico is the mestizo. And so that was kind of the majority average person was a mestizo, and they didn't necessarily always have the same rights and privileges, and certainly did not get looked up to in the same way that a Creole or definitely not a Peninsulate would look at them. And then below that, you had your Indios and your Negros. That's the Indians and slaves, and they were both their rights were well, there were a lot less rights the Creoles or even the mestizos. And so they were always looked upon as being ignorant or unworthy to do anything except labor and unskilled labor. You wouldn't necessarily go out of your way to teach them too much, except that you would expect them to be good Roman Catholics because you have an obligation to educate the Indians for so that they can be good Christians. And there was also an expectation that you would do the same thing for your slaves. So, all right, so that's what's going on in Spanish America. And so that this video isn't too long and hard to download, what I'm going to do is I'll do another one on British America. All right, until then, I'll talk to you later.